1 year ago, we received the second DLC for Risk of Rain 2, Seekers of the Storm. This was the first major DLC to be entirely developed by Gearbox Software after the original developers Hopoo Games sold the Risk of Rain IP to their publishing partner back in 2022. Fans were understandably skeptical with Gearbox taking over development of a game that was so painstakingly built and balanced by the same small group over at Hopoo from early access through the Survivors of the Void DLC. While content took a while to come out due to their limited production bandwidth and console players wouldn't see content released for months, in some cases years later, players knew what they received was mostly a polished product with thoughtful and balanced design, and that the wait was worth it. Would this mentality change as Gearbox took charge? Would they respect the game that Hopoo Games built? Could they match the quality bar set by Hopoo? Or would the AAA mindset take over and things would be rushed and not thought through? Well, unfortunately, it was the latter. Seekers of the Storm released, and it was clearly rushed out the door before some, or really, I should say, all of the polish. There was a myriad of problems that ranged from technical issues, like all the damage both given and received tied to frame rate, UI bugs that made it hard to tell how much damage the player took, and various graphical bugs that made it difficult to interact with the game. This DLC also had lackluster character design, not well thought out items that were either very lackluster in their effect or would hinder the player, and no, we're not talking about lunar items this time. New elite types that were extremely punishing and would either rob you of all your money or insta-kill you if your proc chain made its way into a bubble. And to top it all off, the False Sun boss fight was a crapshoot with hard to read attacks and a power skill that made a balanced fight near impossible. The only two ways to win was to rush to the fight to get there before the difficulty scaling could catch up, or build up your survivor to the point where you could instantly melt the boss. This DLC so thoroughly ruined the experience of Risk of Rain 2 that many players started backpatching to the previous version of the game. There were some positives that came with this DLC on release. The new stages were pretty good, adding the Halcyon shrines that could put you on the False Sun path added more variety to runs. The new survivor skins were dope. Also, while it was creating a lot of problems at launch, Gearbox unified the codebase so both PC and console could receive updates at the same time. And who could forget Sailstar? The backlash Gearbox received from this release was immense, and they immediately got to work fixing the game. A few weeks later, they fixed most of the technical issues, making the game playable, so if players wanted to, they could turn off the DLC and at least enjoy the game the way it was. That's another thing worth mentioning. This update broke the game for everyone. It wasn't even just the people who bought the DLC. If you updated to the new title update, it was ruined for you. So the game was playable, but Gearbox was faced with having to essentially rebuild the DLC because the additions they developed were so poorly conceived and executed. A little more than 2 months after the DLC release, Gearbox announced a roadmap to fix and improve the broken elements of the DLC. They laid out 3 updates that would improve items, survivors, and enemies, including the False Sun boss fight. A year later, and here we are. All updates have been released, and this content is so much different than the DLC we received a year ago. In this video, I wanted to compare how far we've come and give you my recommendation on whether Seekers of the Storm is worth your time and money in 2025. At launch, the items that arrived with Seekers of the Storm were for the most part lackluster and not well thought out. Certain items would break the game or destroy runs at no fault of the player besides picking the item up in the first place, but who can blame someone for picking up items in the game that centers around acquiring items to become stronger? Some great examples of items screwing players over include Unstable Transmitter. In its original state, this would teleport the player to a random point in the stage when your survivor's health got low. Not only was this incredibly disorienting to the player and would sometimes teleport the player into even more danger than they were before, sometimes the game would teleport you into an area you couldn't even get out of, like inside a closed shipping crate on Rally Point Delta. Or, if the player had a warped echo in their inventory, Mithrix would become nearly invincible when he acquired it in stage 4 of the encounter. Outside of these game-breaking interactions, the new items didn't feel fun to use. The item effects wouldn't justify its rarity. I'm looking at you, Warbonds. And didn't really synergize with anything else in the game. The only item that was liked in the entire expansion at launch was Sailstar, and that was the only item left untouched through these updates. On December 10th, 2024, Phase 1 released and it overhauled most of the items released in the expansion. Thankfully, a lot of improvements made to these items was more of what the community expected when it came to thoughtful creativity and balance that comes with Risk of Rain releases. Red items felt worth their status. Items synergized in the game sandbox better, like Warp Echo interacting with damage taken items such as Tougher Times and medkits. Unstable Transmitter now teleports enemies away from the player and grants a barrier, and would be consumed per stage on use, making it a powerful survival tool that no longer ruined runs. I could go through the entire list, but patch notes exist for a reason, and all I'm trying to get across with these few examples is that Gearbox listened, they thought things through, and they crafted a set of items that add to the experience, creates fun new ways to build with survivors. It also restored a lot of confidence that this team could in fact develop items that were the same flavor that Hopoo would have made if they made the DLC. All in all, this first update knocked it out of the park, and the player base was eagerly awaiting the next two phases of Seekers 2.0. Seekers of the Storm released with 3 new survivors, Seeker, False Sun, and the eagerly anticipated return of Chef. I'll admit that these characters were one of the stronger aspects of this DLC at launch. They, for the most part, felt powerful, they had unique kits that interacted with items in fun ways, but there was a lot of jank with these characters. Seeker, for the most part, was fine, maybe just some confusion with meditation stacks, and the main benefit of reviving players only being available in co-op play. False Sun was very powerful with a set of abilities that hit like a truck, along with a growth intrinsic that gave you more stacks of your abilities the more health you had. It made for a character that played differently than anything else we've ever seen in the game. His biggest shortcomings was the movement, and melee felt awkward and frustrating as it failed to connect with enemies from time to time. Chef was the character in need of the most improvement. His primary dice was hard to control and had a weird 3-stack limit, and did not feel good to use at all, because if you did what you do with most characters, is spam your primary abilities, there would be moments where you would hit a brief cooldown, which did not feel good at all. On top of that, his secondary skill, Seer, required you to basically be in melee range, and for a character whose kit was not very melee friendly, it didn't feel good. And his alternate special, Yes Chef, fell short to give players an adequate power boost. In Phase 3 of the Seekers of the Storm 2.0 update, most of these issues were fixed. Seeker gained the ability to revive herself by stacking Tranquility, a much requested addition since it was one of the more attractive capabilities of her kit. It could only be used in co-op. Along with that change, they added a couple more abilities to give Seeker more variety. Reprieve, an alternate utility that adds a nice crowd control element to Seeker's kit, and Palm Blast for those who prefer slapping enemies across the face to get their Tranquility stacks instead of executing a quick time event in meditation. Seeker was the character that needed the least help in this DLC, but these additions definitely added to the experience. False Sun also saw some new abilities added to his kit in the secondary and utility slot, as well as some balance tweaks. Gearbox also improved his animations to make it more satisfying and more connected for the player. On top of that, one of the biggest complaints about False Sun was how slow he felt, so Gearbox made a handful of his abilities agile. False Sun was always a powerful survivor and really just needed some adjustments to the feel of his gameplay, so Gearbox fixed that while giving us some new toys to play with in the process. Chef was the survivor in need of the most improvement. As I said at the top of the section, his primary wasn't very good, his skills contradicted his character identity, and his abilities were underwhelming. While admittedly Chef is probably still my least favorite character in this DLC, Gearbox did a great job with improving his kit. They reworked his primary in a way that gave the player more control over how it was deployed, between having cleavers return back to the player as soon as it reached the apex, or the player could hold down the ability button to leave the cleaver spinning in place, which was a great way to combat larger boss enemies that didn't have much mobility, creating a high impact damage over time attack. Along with that improvement, the range of Chef's Seer secondary was increased, and they also added Icebox as an alternate in the slot. An alternate utility ability was also added, giving players a decent amount of options when selecting a loadout, which is nice considering at launch Chef had almost no loadout options. The new utility skill, Oil Spill, gave Chef vertical mobility while leaving oil slicks on the ground beneath them. Those oil slicks could be frozen or ignited with Chef's secondary. A fun in-kit synergy which adds crowd control to his kit. It should be also noted that his Glaze special ability now also left those oil slicks, so you can have that same interaction with a secondary. Furthermore, in the special slot, the main improvement was the rework of Yes Chef, where boosted abilities now pack more of a punch and was more worthy of a spot in a player's loadout. All in all, while these updates were much needed, it was probably the least impactful update of Seekers 2.0. We could always play as other survivors, and these survivors weren't necessarily broken, they just were lackluster and not well thought through at launch. After these updates, Seeker, Chef, and False Sun have become community favorites, so hats off to Gearbox for looking at the shortcomings of these survivors and thoughtfully improving them in a way that matches their identity and playstyle. At the launch of Seekers of the Storm, there were many issues and shortcomings that were hard to ignore, but by far one of the most egregious things was the design of the new elites. We'll get to the False Sun boss fight in a bit, because while I do believe that that fight was flawed in many ways, that fight wasn't constantly shoved in your face to make your entire run miserable. The same can't be said about the elites. Simply put, what was Gearbox thinking with these enemies? Starting with Gilded Elites. This was an enemy that you could encounter at any point in your run, and at launch of the DLC, they would periodically form a gold bubble around them that would buff their health, and if you damaged them, they would steal your gold, and the more gold they stole, the more armor they gained. This ability was not able to be countered besides just not engaging with them when they had the bubble around them, but even then, if a proc chain or an AoE attack hit them while they were in the state, you would still lose your gold. This was extremely punishing in early game, as every kill matters when you're trying to get your first couple of items, and encountering a gilded enemy that has a crazy huge health bar and would also bankrupt you was such a non-starter, it was ridiculous. As a general rule, having an enemy that disincentivizes you from engaging with them in a game whose gameplay loop centers around killing enemies quickly so you can acquire more items and with that power to beat the game is a bad design. Which brings me to the second elite they added in this DLC, Twisted Elites. In this enemy's initial design at launch, Twisted Elites would spawn with a large aura around them similar to Celestine enemies. If you shot an enemy inside of this aura besides the Twisted Elite, all damage you dealt to that enemy would be reflected back to you. No way to counter it, and it would often result in a quick death. What made this even more punishing is the fact that these elites wouldn't spawn in until the player looped. So assuming that the player is coming in with an entire loop's worth of loot, there's bound to be some decent damage and AoE being dealt by the player. So even if you were shooting an enemy outside the aura, if AoE or a proc like an ATG or a Uke or god forbid a ceremonial dagger made its way into the bubble, the player would take damage, basically punishing the player for being powerful 6 stages into their run. I can't even begin to describe how bad this enemy design was. How it got through playtesting is so beyond me. Thankfully, these enemies were reworked in Phase 1 of the Seekers 2.0 updates. Gilded Elites now only stole gold when they hit you with their attacks, punishing players for the right thing, taking damage versus dealing damage. Twisted Elites also got a complete rework in a way that made it possible to counter them. Instead of an aura, the Twisted Elite would tether to enemies around them. If you shot a tethered enemy, a large spiky ball would begin to charge above the Twisted's head, and once that ball got charged up, it would launch at the player. This ball could be destroyed or dodged by the player. Just reading that, I probably don't have to say too much more about how this was a massive improvement from the initial design. Twisted Elites no longer punish you for having a powerful build and has a way to be countered, something that seems like a no-brainer, but hey, I'm happy that they were able to arrive at that conclusion eventually. In addition to the elites launching in a rough state, the False Sun boss fight also didn't fare too well at launch. I should make it clear, while the False Sun fight was flawed, I still think it was a better constructed fight than the Voidling fight we got in Survivors of the Void. This fight had clear mechanics with an agile boss and an evolving arena, so it was a good foundation. There were just a couple of things that made this fight feel half-baked. First, let's start with the boss fight itself. There were many attacks in this fight that were hard to read, whether it was from lack of or misleading visual clues, or lack of or too quiet audio cues. It could be hard to tell what was going on in any part of this fight. This was not a great feeling when the boss could one-shot you with his abilities or disable your own abilities, leaving you as a sitting duck. So much of getting good at a boss fight is about understanding what the enemy is about to do and reacting to it accordingly. Take Mithrix for example. Do the fight enough times and you'll be able to understand how he dashes, the sound he makes when he's about to slam, how many times he can do his pizza attack, and even how to skip the last phase of the encounter. Knowledge is everything, and while I think there should always be some form of randomization in a fight to give even the most experienced players a run for their money, the players should also be able to understand the enemy's moveset and how those moves behave. The second problem with the False Sun boss fight was the scaling, and this was more of an issue with how you got to the fight in the first place. False Sun scaled aggressively with the timers, so if you came waltzing into the fight at a somewhat normal time, say like 40 minutes to an hour with an okay build that wouldn't have much of an issue being Mithrix, you were likely to get stomped by False Sun. His attacks hit like a tank, and he had a very large health pool. In the early days of this DLC, players would either rush to him as quickly as possible, basically beating the difficulty scaling, or you would do a loop or two to ensure that when you got to False Sun, you could melt him and not deal with any of the mechanics of the fight whatsoever. Part of what forced players into these playstyles was the limited ways in which you could get to the fight in the first place. To get to the False Sun fight, you would have to enter in what was called the Green Path. You enabled this by completing a Halcyon Shrine, which was almost only spawning on stage 1. This would force the player to either make the decision to go for a False Sun kill in the first 5 minutes of a run, or they would have to wait until they got back to a stage 1 environment by looping. There are other ways to False Sun, such as getting a Green Path stage in the Meditation Soup in the Bazaar, or through the Aurelian Night stage, but more often than not, it was more reliable to go through the Halcyon Shrine. The second phase of the Seekers 2.0 update would improve the False Sun experience, tweaking many things like his scaling, how he telegraphed his attacks, and reworked audio to make the player more aware to when certain attacks were happening. They also made it so Halcyon Shrines would spawn on more stages throughout the run, although they still are very heavily weighted to spawn on stage 1. Nonetheless, this change gave the players more opportunities to choose what they wanted to do with their run. And while I'll say I don't think any final boss will ever beat Mithrix in this game, False Sun is definitely, once again, like I said at the top of the section, better than Voidling. And it's a good start for Gearbox as far as their boss design goes. I don't think you'll ever be able to beat Mithrix, but this was definitely a very good attempt. I know this video was probably more in depth than what it had to be. It could have been more straightforward conversation about why I think the DLC is now absolutely worth your time and money. But as I sat down to write this script, I thought about who I was really writing this for. There were so much of this game's player base that heard about the dumpster fire that this DLC was at release and left the game entirely, thinking that Gearbox would never be able to do what Hopoo was able to do when they were developing this game. I was almost one of those people. After this DLC came out, I basically sat and waited until Seekers 2.0 started coming out because I was so fed up with how broken this game was. When Seekers of the Storm dropped, it broke Risk of Rain 2 on so many levels, and I feared that this game that I loved was ruined forever. But to Gearbox's credit, they stuck with it, they listened to feedback, and while it took longer than we wanted, they did deliver a solid DLC that is absolutely worth it. Also, seeing how Gearbox went about redesigning many aspects of this DLC gave me a lot of confidence that they can match the pedigree of Hopoo and have me very optimistic for the future of this game, or even the sequel, whenever that may come. So, in short, is Seekers of the Storm worth it in 2025? Yes. Absolutely, it adds more fun ways to play what was already an incredible game. Gearbox pulled it off, and I am beyond relieved that they did. I'd like to thank you for taking the time for watching this video. If you made it to the end, I invite you to like the video. It helps me out a lot as a growing channel. If you enjoyed this content, I welcome you to subscribe to the channel. Most of what I do here are gameplay videos, but I plan on making more news and reviews for Alloy Collective when it releases. I also stream twice a week right here on YouTube. Feel free to drop by and say hello. We stream primarily Risk of Rain 2, but I also plan on incorporating more roguelikes and roguelites, as well as some Borderlands in the near future. If that sounds appealing to you, I invite you to stick around. But again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.